In 2017, giant fires roamed across the Portuguese territory and the consequences could not be more tragic. More than 120 people died and all records related with burned area were broken. It was the worst tragedy with fires in Portugal's history. What happened that year was the perfect storm of years and years of bad policies, negligence, disorganization, incompetence, corruption, and other criminal activities that for decades transformed the Portuguese forest into an unstoppable, flammable mass that was used as fuel by the largest fires we have ever seen in Portugal. In fact, the fire of October in particular was the largest fire in the world that year. In tragedies of this magnitude, it is generally very hard to point the finger at a single person because there's usually more than one involved. But in this case in particular, there is definitely one person that is connected with all the bad policies, disorganization, corruption, and criminal activities. And that person is the current Prime Minister, António Costa. António Costa is a career politician. He has no curriculum in anything and for decades he only jumped from position to position in socialist governments or in the Lisbon City Hall, until he finally reached the highest position, which is Prime Minister, in 2015, when he made deals with the far left to topple the recently democratically elected government. António Costa did not reach the Prime Minister position by winning an election, but rather by making backstage deals with the far left to get power. Deals that even today destroy and impoverish Portugal on a daily basis. But today I will focus only on the policies that contributed to the death of more than 120 people in 2017 and how little or nothing changed since then, because pretty much the same people are in power today and thus the same policies are in practice. In 2005, José Sócrates was elected Prime Minister with the first absolute majority for the Socialist Party in Portugal. As number 2 of his government, José Sócrates picked António Costa, that got the position of Minister of Internal Affairs. And it was in this position that António Costa created the most extreme policies that even today still have consequences for the country and for the Portuguese people in general. One of the first disastrous policies started in 2006 with the elimination of the forest guard position. A forest guard had a few important tasks, namely the protection of natural areas and also fire prevention. The forest guard was also the authority that tried to guarantee that companies that sell wood would follow the laws of the country in regards to forest management and wood cutting. But António Costa, in his infinite incompetence and stupidity, eliminated the forest guard position, and thus the already little forest vigilance that existed was extinct completely. Also, in 2006, António Costa was involved in the creation of a contract that was quite damaging for the public finances and the Portuguese taxpayer, but also quite bad for firefighting. At the time, Portugal did not have its own aerial means to fight fires, which is why it would rent planes and helicopters to fight fires from private companies. But in an alleged attempt to reduce costs, António Costa, with the help of his personal friend Diogo Lacerda Machado, bought 6 Kamov helicopters from a Russian company. This operation cost a bit more than 42 million euros. But the alleged savings ended up being more expensive than before because the helicopters were not delivered on time, which meant Portugal had to rent planes and helicopters again. Furthermore, the contract that António Costa created with a new public company that was supposed to manage the Portuguese state planes and helicopters was filled with suspicious activities from the socialists involved in it, which is why the finance court sent all the information to the state attorney's office. However, and as usual, the state's attorney's office does nothing against the socialists, no matter how much taxpayer money they steal. Problems with the Kamov helicopters continued, however, because even after the deadly fires in 2017, the helicopters were still grounded because some of them didn't even work. So another disastrous and criminal policy by António Costa that always places his interests and his friends' interests above the needs of the country and also endanger the lives of the Portuguese people. But it's probably with the next policy and contract that António Costa did the most harm to Portuguese taxpayers and to the lives of the Portuguese people, in the context of national emergencies, and that proved once and for all how incompetent and criminal he is. SIRESP is the system for communication during emergencies in Portugal. Its initial contract was created by the Santana Lopes government, but because the socialist president Jorge Sampaio fired that government and handed power to the socialists again, José Sócrates' government inherited that contract. However, the state's attorney's office declared that contract void because there were doubts about its legality. But António Costa ignored all that and redid the contract as he wanted to, and with the exact same company, while he was Minister of Internal Affairs in 2006. So let's have a look at this contract, created and signed by António Costa, specifically Clause 17, the one with the most shocking details. The title for Clause 17 is Higher Force. 17.1. For the effect of the contract, higher force cases will be considered as unpredictable and irresistible events, which consequences will happen regardless of the will or the performance of the operator, even though indirect, that were proved to prevent or to make more complex the ability to follow the contractual obligations. 17.2. As examples of higher force cases, there are acts of war or subversion, hostilities or invasion, rebellion, terrorism or epidemics, lightning, explosions, large floods, cyclones, earthquakes, and other natural disasters that directly affect the activities related with the contract. 17.3. When a higher force case occurs, the operator is not held responsible for the non-compliance of the contract. So to sum up, SIRESP is a system for communication during emergencies, but according to the contract, it does not need to work during an emergency, and the operator is not held responsible for SIRESP's failures during an emergency. I would suggest you translate and read the contract yourself because it is the perfect example of incompetence, bad and criminal management, and the proof that Portuguese politicians, and António Costa in particular, do not know what they are doing when it comes to the safety of the Portuguese people. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened in the tragic year of 2017, when SIRESP failed more times than it actually worked, especially in the situations it was most needed. Due to communication failures, several people were diverted from a road called IC8 by authorities to National Road 236, where they ended up being burned alive. Since SIRESP was constantly failing, the fire departments had to resort to older communication systems so that they could coordinate their efforts and resources on the field. In 2013, the investigation journalist Leal had already made everyone aware of the failures of SIRESP during some storms. But TVI, a private TV station, censored the piece. And if you follow my channel, you already know that the Portuguese media is completely controlled by the socialists, and everything that can be inconvenient to the socialists will be buried. In this report, Leal showed that SIRESP, the system for communication during emergencies, would fail even in places where a simple cell phone would work without issues. All professionals on the field were often forced to use other means of communication because they either didn't have enough SIRESP equipments, or even if they did, those equipments would fail constantly. In the new contract created by António Costa, SIRESP didn't even have the necessary generators or batteries to make sure that the system would work for more than 6 hours in a row. António Costa actually removed them from the old contract that came from the government of Santana Lopes. So it's yet again another example of how incompetent, ignorant, and even criminal these career politicians like António Costa and friends are, because they create and sign contracts for a worthless system that will cause more problems than solutions. But of course, the main objective of these politicians is to make these contracts at the expense of the taxpayer and get paybacks from the companies they signed the contracts with, because these companies will not even be responsible for the failures of the system. Meanwhile, the taxpayer is not only paying for all this, but they also have their lives at risk whenever SIRESP is involved. SIRESP will cost around 600 million euros until 2021, which is when the contract ends. The contract is a public-private partnership. But this didn't end here, because in 2019 António Costa's government bought SIRESP from the operator for 7 million euros and paid an extra 11 million euros to keep the system running for 18 months more. The socialists call these 11 million a compensation fee to the operator to keep a system that fails more often than not during emergencies in active state. Antonio Costa has direct responsibility for this system and for the contract signed with the operator, because it literally protects the operator that only has advantages at the expense of the Portuguese taxpayer and has no responsibilities. It is also a threat to the safety and lives of the Portuguese people that may have to depend on SIRESP working or not. Antonio Costa is therefore indirectly responsible for those that die, because this so-called emergency system doesn't work when it needs to work. All of this would already be enough to accuse and take Antonio Costa to trial for the deaths in the fires of 2017. But Antonio Costa was not satisfied, because that year, just a few months before the usual fire season, he replaced half the civil protection commanders. All these commanders with many years of experience were replaced with Socialist Party members. People with degrees in sports and law with zero experience in civil protection took over, and that inexperience was very clear when they tried to manage resources on the field in the deadliest year ever in Portugal. And since now the Socialist Party had almost complete control over civil protection after firing competent people and replacing them with incompetent socialists, civil protection moved to censor all information regarding fires that year. The fire departments would often talk to journalists and point out SIRESP's failures, and also the failures on the field, and how civil protection could not do a proper job of managing resources. And so in July 2017, after the tragedy in June, civil protection moved to prevent any information from being leaked. From that point on, only civil protection could do press releases and talk about what happened on the field, the same civil protection now under the almost complete control of the socialists. Given all this, there is a set of questions that should be asked to the socialist government, and specifically to Antonio Costa, because the socialist policies were responsible for the huge loss of life in 2017. How many people could have been saved if SIRESP actually worked during emergencies? How many people could have been saved if the coordination on the field had been made by competent people with experience in civil protection instead of being made by Socialist Party members with zero experience in civil protection? How many fires could have been prevented or detected early by forest guards? Other important questions could also be asked to the president, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa. Why were the mistakes in June 2017 made again in October 2017, and Antonio Costa and his government did not suffer a single consequence for their criminal incompetence? How many Portuguese people have to die for the socialist government to have any consequences for their criminal incompetence? None of these questions were actually asked to Antonio Costa or Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, because the media in Portugal is nothing more than a vehicle for the socialist propaganda and for the clown president. But even if they were asked, the answers would not have much meaning or consequences, because the socialists control everything in Portugal, including the media, and are not punished for anything. The only one that could easily punish them is the president. But Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa did everything he could to protect the socialist government ever since he was elected. Right after the tragedy in Pedrógão Grande, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa rushed to say that everything that could be done to prevent the tragedy was done, when that was an absolute lie. Furthermore, after dozens of deaths in October of 2017, the second biggest tragedy that year, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa did nothing. He should have fired the government immediately, but instead chose to ask the parliament if they still supported the government. Which was a nonsense question, because the socialists made a deal with the far left and had an absolute majority in parliament. The far left would never remove support from the socialists, no matter how many people died, and Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa knew that. He knew nothing would happen to the government, and asking the parliament if they still supported the government was nothing more than pure theater from a president as corrupt and criminal as Antonio Costa and friends. Besides these ridiculous comments from the president, we also had to deal with the vile and disgusting comments from the socialists themselves, including Antonio Costa, that literally mocked with people's deaths that year, showing what they really are, people without values or principles, the most evil scum on this planet. For example, the Minister of Internal Affairs, Constança Urbano de Sousa, that refused to resign for months and months after the first big tragedy that year, said that it would be great if she resigned because she would have the vacations she didn't have until now. And she said this right after dozens of people died in October 2017. The Secretary of State for Internal Affairs, Jorge Gomes, said that people should not wait for the fire department or planes to solve their problems, clearly hinting that people had to fight fires themselves with their own resources, when that was precisely the reason why many died that year, because they were trying to protect their houses and property since there was no fire department or planes around, thanks to the criminal incompetence of the socialists. And of course the comment from Antonio Costa at the end of 2017. Antonio Costa considered 2017 a tasty year. Once again, 2017 was the most tragic year with fires in Portugal's history. But for Antonio Costa it was tasty, because what really matters for criminal scum like Antonio Costa are his personal and party interests, which went quite well that year, so more than 120 people dying is completely irrelevant for this disgusting being that is Antonio Costa. It's an insult, it's an offense to all the victims and to all the families of those victims that were still grieving for their loss, people that died thanks to the absurd and criminal policies of Antonio Costa and the socialist government. And I'm not even touching the fact that the socialists took advantage of the tragedies that year to try and sell anti-smoke cloths, to take money from the donations to help victims of the fires, and also to take money that was supposed to be used to rebuild houses destroyed by the fires, but instead to use that money to build houses of friends not affected by the fires at all. With just what I mentioned in this video, you should already be aware of the absolute vile and criminal scum that is in the Portuguese government. Thanks to the corrupt and criminal policies of Antonio Costa and the socialists, the Portuguese taxpayers suffered like never before, as well as the outrageous amount of lives lost thanks to those policies, something never before seen in this country. The Portuguese people is literally robbed and killed by the socialists without any consequences and always protected by the injustice system and by the president. And all this is yet again another proof that Portugal is a dictatorship. Only in election periods could the people do something to punish the socialists. However, and despite all I've just told you, in the regional elections of 2017, with the dozens of deaths still fresh in people's memory, the Socialist Party was awarded one of its biggest victory yet in these types of elections. And in the 2019 elections, the Socialist Party nearly got an absolute majority on its own in parliament. What kind of people is this that is robbed and killed by the socialists, yet not only does not punish them, but in fact rewards them? The answer to that question is that the Portuguese people is extremely ignorant and easily fooled by the leftist propaganda after decades of indoctrination. They are ignorant because the minority that actually votes always votes for the same people and parties, and thus in the exact same policies that never had any success. Also ignorant because the majority that does not vote think they are punishing criminals like Antonio Costa or José Sócrates that destroy this country every day for decades now. But they are wrong, because by not voting they guarantee that these criminals remain in their positions of power, because the minority that always votes will vote for the exact same people over and over, and this needs to change. The tragic consequences of the socialist policies and of Antonio Costa in particular should mobilize the majority of the Portuguese people to punish these criminals and remove them from power forever. The Portuguese injustice system will not do it because it's completely corrupted and controlled by the socialists, and thus only the people can punish them in the elections, if elections still exist. Every time you vote for these criminals, you are an accomplice of the crimes committed by Antonio Costa and friends. You are an accomplice to the more than 120 people that died in the fires of 2017. And for those that do not vote, you are an accomplice to those that always vote for the same people, that keep these criminals in power and that guarantee that the same disastrous policies continue in place. Since the socialists never had any consequences, they will continue to do what they've done so far. They will continue to place their personal and party interests above the interests of Portugal and the Portuguese people. And this means that tragedies like the ones in 2017 will continue to happen. I hope you like this, and I'll see you next time.